They say the match ended before most people understood it had begun. There was no knockout, no raised voice, no visible struggle, only a brief movement, so brief that several witnesses later disagreed on what they saw. What everyone agreed on came afterward. The room went quiet. Men who had trained for years stopped looking at each other. And no one asked for a second round. The result was never reversed. The explanation was never publicly given. And the people who were there spoke about it carefully, as if volume might distort the truth. Pause. The building itself was unremarkable. A low, rectangular structure tucked behind a quiet street. Its walls painted a neutral gray that had long faded under the sun. Inside, the floor was bare wood, scuffed in places where generations of feet had pressed down through years of training. Mirrors lined the far wall, but they reflected more than just the present. They carried echoes of every demonstration that had ever taken place within those walls. The men arrived one by one. Each carried a history that preceded him. Certificates, medals, whispered accounts of past victories, hours spent perfecting stance, strike, and response. They were not just fighters. They were representatives of their lineage. And lineage mattered here. Discipline had a sound, and it could be read in the way a man adjusted his uniform or held his shoulders as he stepped into the open space. Bruce Lee entered last, quietly. There was no announcement, no flourish, no show of ego. His presence was felt rather than proclaimed. The air subtly shifted. Some of the men glanced at each other, assessing. Was this the same Bruce Lee they had heard about in stories? The man who had redefined what strength looked like? Their curiosity was mixed with the kind of tension that comes from recognizing an authority whose measure is absolute but invisible. The room itself seemed to contract around him, the collective awareness of every trainee amplifying with each measured step he took. He did not speak. He did not bow or gesture. He simply observed, taking in the space, the people, the unspoken challenge that existed in the silence before the action. A few tried to break the quiet, offering polite greetings or nods of acknowledgement. Each was met with a calm, direct gaze, neither approving nor dismissive. There was no need. Presence alone conveyed what words never could. The understanding that the measure of a man is not in what he claims, but in what he allows others to discover for themselves. The walls, the floor, and the watching eyes were all witnesses. In that space, reputation had already settled like dust on every surface. And by the time any of the men realized it, the first shift had already occurred. Not through movement, not through noise, but through the subtle, undeniable force of absolute confidence and silent mastery. The room was prepared. The reputations were in place. And the moment that would redefine expectation and authority waited, quiet, at the edge of inevitability. The air in the room had thickened without a word being spoken. No one issued a formal challenge, no trainer declared a test, and yet every pair of eyes measured distance, stance, and readiness. The tension was not loud. It had no announcement. It existed in the small shifts of weight, the fraction of a second pauses between breaths, and the subtle tightening of fists. The trainees, confident in their experience, were certain they understood the hierarchy. Their skills were honed, their techniques disciplined through countless repetitions. They assumed control of the space simply by virtue of numbers and training. Yet there was a quiet disturbance in that assumption. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A presence that did not seek to dominate but whose very existence reframed authority. Bruce Lee did not challenge anyone. He did not raise a hand or make a statement. Instead, he moved with an economy that seemed casual to the untrained eye. A step forward, a glance, a shift in balance. And in that movement, a measure of understanding passed silently to the men around him. Those who had relied on conventional intimidation began to reconsider what dominance looked like. It was not loud, it was not forceful, it was inevitable. A few trainees made small adjustments, testing distance, recalculating reach. None spoke, Yet each interaction became a silent negotiation. The room held its collective breath, as if aware that something was unfolding that could not be interrupted by talking or posturing. The authority was not taken. It was acknowledged, reluctantly, through observation and reflection. In that space, the challenge was understood without articulation. The men did not need to strike, to block, or to demonstrate their technique. Their presence alone became a mirror, reflecting what they believed they controlled and what they had yet to comprehend. The realization was quiet but growing. This was a test not of strength, but of perception, patience, and restraint. By the time the first subtle exchange occurred, the outcome was no longer in question. What remained was a formality, the proof, brief and decisive, that would transform confidence into caution and ego into respect. The challenge had not been issued with words, yet it had been received. And in that understanding, the hierarchy shifted, imperceptibly, before any movement had truly begun. The spectators arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first. They were not there for spectacle or excitement. They came seeking clarity. Some were senior instructors, others fellow students, all drawn by the whispered anticipation that had traveled ahead of the day. They settled along the edges of the room, forming a sparse ring of observation, their silence adding weight to the air. Each pair of eyes became an instrument, measuring minute changes in stance, subtle shifts in balance, even the tension held in a shoulder or a hand. Every glance had purpose, every pause held meaning, and in this concentrated attention, the men in the center became aware that their every thought was reflected back to them, magnified by the quiet appraisal of witnesses. Time slowed in the room. Breaths lengthened, not from fear, but from the collective understanding that something decisive was imminent, though its form was unknown. The trainees, confident in their technique and past victories, began to feel the weight of evaluation. The more they sought to demonstrate readiness, the more elusive certainty became. Bruce Lee moved with calm, deliberate economy. His eyes scanned, not to intimidate, but to understand. There was no hurry, no forced engagement. And yet, with each measured step and minimal gesture, he communicated a clarity of perception the others could not match. The men began to realize that the measure of mastery was not in visible action, but in the invisible certainty that preceded it. As minutes stretched, the room collectively held its silence, and tension mounted not in noise but in awareness. The weight of watching eyes became a pressure the untrained ego could not sustain. Observers noted the subtle signs. A hand lingering slightly longer in readiness, a foot shifting unconsciously, a breath caught too long. Each was a signal that the mind was processing more than it could immediately control. It was here, in the concentrated gaze of many and the stillness of one, that the first cracks began, not in muscle, not in form, but in confidence. The room had become a crucible, its intensity defined not by confrontation, but by observation. And those who watched, along with those at the center, began to understand that the coming demonstration would leave no question unanswered. It began and ended almost imperceptibly. No shout heralded it. No stance was held for dramatic effect. One moment, Bruce Lee stood at the edge of the open space, eyes calm, posture relaxed. The next, a brief exchange had occurred. To the untrained or inattentive, it might have seemed like nothing at all. A slight shift in angle, a hand deflected, a foot repositioned. Yet those closest understood immediately. What had transpired was complete. The trainees, so certain of their preparedness, felt the shift before they recognized it. Movements they believed decisive were anticipated and neutralized before full engagement. Timing, distance, and force were not tested, they were quietly redefined. Every adjustment Bruce Lee made was minimal, deliberate, and entirely sufficient. Nothing was wasted. There was no aggression, only precision, and the clarity of intent left no room for error. Observers noticed the subtlety of it first. Eyes widened, not from shock, but from the realization that what they had assumed to be mastery was only preparation. What appeared to be ordinary motion was, in fact, an exact calculation, a demonstration of authority so understated that anyone expecting spectacle could miss it entirely. The trainees themselves were slower to understand. A flicker of hesitation here, a pause there, signaled the first internal acknowledgement that their assumptions had been overturned. Confidence began to erode quietly, not through pain or public embarrassment, but through comprehension. Each man was forced to reckon with a truth he could not deny. Mastery does not announce itself with noise, and dominance does not require struggle. By the time the exchange concluded, the room held a different rhythm. Silence deepened, heavier now with realization. There were no cheers, no protests, no immediate acknowledgement. Only the subtle, inevitable understanding that what had occurred could not be reversed, and that the demonstration, so brief, so precise, had already rewritten expectations. It was over, and yet, in its quiet unfolding, it left an echo far louder than any shout or strike could have produced. The room remained silent, yet the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The men who had entered confident, certain in their skill and preparedness, now moved differently. Their shoulders sagged imperceptibly. Their hands no longer hovered with the same assured readiness. Nothing had physically struck them, yet something essential had changed. It was not humiliation. It was recognition, the kind that arrives slowly, creeping through every thought and motion. The realization that strength alone is not mastery, that technique without understanding is incomplete. The trainees felt the collapse inwardly, a quiet unraveling of assumptions that had been built over years. Each step, each adjustment carried the weight of their new awareness. Observers described it later as a strange phenomenon. Men breaking without contact, discipline bending without force. Confidence, which had been their foundation, now seemed fragile, reliant on circumstance they could no longer control. Bruce Lee had demonstrated, in the span of seconds, that control was a matter of perception and timing, not aggression. Some attempted to reassert themselves, moving through practiced forms, striking positions they had repeated countless times. But the subtle mastery they faced left no openings, no room for performance. The collapse was not immediate or dramatic. It was quiet, incremental, and undeniable. By the end of the session, the men were still standing, still moving, yet fundamentally altered in understanding. The lesson spread through observation and reflection, not lecture. Those who had been present did not need to recount the details in full. The silence, the pause, the weight in the room, these conveyed the truth. Strength is visible. Mastery is invisible. Confidence without comprehension can shatter, even when no blow lands. And in that quiet aftermath, the men carried a new measure of respect, not only for the demonstration they had witnessed but for the authority that had required no words, no force to establish. Years later, those who had been there still recalled the day, though details had softened at the edges. The precise motions, the subtle shifts of hand and foot, became stories told in fragments, each witness emphasizing what had struck them most. Yet the essence remained intact. What had occurred could not be contested, only remembered. The event grew quieter in its recounting, losing the immediacy of physical demonstration but gaining weight in meaning. Trainees and instructors alike carried the lesson forward, not as a tale of triumph, but as a measure of clarity and restraint. The story became a reference point in training halls, a benchmark for what mastery demanded. Awareness, precision, and the calm authority to command attention without imposing force. Legends formed, not from exaggeration, but from the inevitability of the outcome. New students were told to watch closely, to learn through observation and reflection, and to understand that mastery does not rely on spectacle. Over time, Bruce Lee's quiet authority became a template, a standard by which the unspoken measure of skill could be recognized. What remained most enduring was not the technique itself, but the psychological imprint. Men who had once believed in the primacy of sheer effort now understood the subtler forms of influence. Authority could bend expectation, redefine confidence, and shift perception, all without a single overt strike. The room, the witnesses, and the demonstration became a story of influence that outlasted memory, preserved by restraint rather than noise. Even decades later, those who recounted the event did so with the same quiet reverence. The lesson had not faded. It had deepened. Bruce Lee's presence, minimal and deliberate, had become a reference point in the world of martial arts, a reminder that true mastery leaves echoes that outlast the visible. And in that echo, the men who had once trained in that room found a standard of excellence far beyond victory or defeat, a quiet authority that continues to teach long after the moment itself has passed.